John Lennon's time in this world was far from blissful. In fact, his personal life was a nearly unending stream of chaos and disastrous events, some cast upon him by cruel fates, others caused by his own behavior. So let's dig deep into the dark underbelly of John Lennon's life. Lennon had a strained relationship with his father, Alfred, who separated from Lennon's mother, Julia, in 1944, 4 years after John was born. As a result, John has said that he never really knew his father and that he didn't see him much until he became famous, at which point Alfred mysteriously turned up again. But it doesn't sound like the reunion went particularly well. As John explained in a 1966 interview, "I saw him and spoke to him and decided I still didn't want to know him." In 1965, the Beatles were on top of the world, and a talent manager named Tony Cartwright discovered Alfred working at a pub. Cartwright shaped Alfred, who was a talented singer himself, into Fred Lennon and attempted to turn him into a recording artist. Unfortunately, his debut album didn't sit well with his son, who reportedly asked his manager Brian Epstein to do all that he could to stop it. Whether Epstein used his industry clout to do this or not, Alfred's singing days were soon over and his record never charted. John only ever saw his father one more time in 1970 when he grabbed him by the collar and screamed at him. Alfred died in 1975, and John eventually expressed regret that he didn't handle their last meeting better. The aptly named dairy farmer George Too Good Smith was John Lennon's uncle through marriage, and indeed he was too good for this world. For most of his childhood, Lennon lived with Smith and Mary Elizabeth Stanley, Smith's wife and Lennon's aunt. A father figure and a profound influence on the young Lennon, Smith was the one who taught the Beatle in the making to read, paint, and draw. He even bought him a musical instrument, a mouth organ. Unfortunately, the good times weren't meant to last. In 1955, the 52-year-old Smith collapsed at his home and died of a liver hemorrhage. Smith's good name hasn't been lost to history, and neither has his final resting place, as his grave was lovingly restored and unveiled in 2015 as part of Lennon's 75th birthday celebrations. Oddly enough, Smith's demise may have inspired a certain Beatles classic in a roundabout way. The churchyard that Smith was buried in also contained the grave of a maid named Eleanor Rigby. Both Lennon and Paul McCartney frequented the churchyard, and although McCartney insists that he made up the name and the character, some people speculate that he may have subconsciously picked up the name from the gravestone. One of the worst moments in Lennon's life happened on July 15, 1958, when his mother, Julia, died in a freak accident. Although the future superstar lived with his aunt and uncle, mother and son were close. She was supportive of his musical endeavors and even bought him his first guitar. So imagine the 17-year-old Lennon's shock when his mother left his aunt's house and was run over by an off-duty policeman when crossing a road on her way to the bus stop. She died instantly. The police officer was neither speeding nor drunk, despite allegations that he may have been. The tragic incident had a deeply traumatizing effect on Lennon. As for the officer, he eventually realized that the woman he hit was the mother of a very well-known person, and Lennon's fame ensured that he kept being reminded of the gruesome accident. He ultimately resigned and became a postman, only to discover that his route included the family home of Paul McCartney. Thus, he now had to haul hundreds of fan letters to the bandmate of the guy whose mother he killed. Some memories, it seems, are inescapable no matter what. Lennon's son from his first marriage, Julian, clearly got some of his dad's artistic genes and world-improving tendencies. After all, he's a photographer, musician, documentary filmmaker, and philanthropist in his own right. However, he doesn't particularly appreciate his father's peacenik public image. In a 1998 interview with The Telegraph, he labeled his dad a hypocrite who preached about peace on earth yet had no love for him or Julian's mother, Cynthia. From Julian's viewpoint, John was a fairly bad dad, an uncommunicative, adulterous head of a family that was eventually torn apart by divorce. However, Julian's animosity toward his father doesn't extend to the ex-Beatles' other family. He says he's on good terms with his half-brother, Sean Lennon, though Sean seems less enthused about keeping in touch than Julian does. He also has respect for Sean's mom, Yoko Ono, even if he doesn't always agree with her.
There was a great deal of anger there, but there's also, I've grown up a lot, and there's been forgiveness since then.
John Lennon liked his drugs, and one particular mind-altering substance affected him so much that it may have played a part in breaking up the Beatles. In 1969, he was addicted to heroin at the same time that many interpersonal gripes were already straining the Fab Four. This was an era when opioid addiction was poorly understood, and the other Beatles watched in increasing alarm as Lennon and Yoko Ono openly partook of the drug, which they recognized as something much more far out than they were willing to get. Lennon attributes the couple's heroin use to the pain they felt after Ono's miscarriage in 1968, though others have insinuated that he started using earlier than that. He's also claimed that heroin was his way to rebel against the other Beatles and their unwillingness to accept Ono as an equal. Regardless, Lennon's heroin use and the mood swings that accompanied it became a real problem after a nasty car accident in Scotland. By the time the band started recording their album Abbey Road, the three other Beatles had to be careful around Lennon because of his explosive rages. They were also uncharacteristically unwilling to challenge his insistence on keeping Ono on hand in the studio, as they could also see that their bandmate was in pain. The Beatles didn't last long after Abbey Road's release, though Ono and Lennon eventually quit heroin. Lennon might have been an esteemed artist and a well-known advocate for peace, but in his private life, he could be a violent man. Unfortunately, the violence very much extended to the women in his life, particularly in his youth. In a 1980 Playboy interview, he almost casually admitted that he had a history as a domestic abuser, having hit his ex-wife Cynthia. He said that the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band track Getting Better, which features lyrics about, quote, being cruel to my woman, beating her and keeping her apart from the things that she loved, was about himself. As he put it, I was a hitter. I couldn't express myself and I hit. Lennon also expressed that he sincerely believed in love and peace, that he became a changed man, and that he was genuinely regretful of his past actions. Still, his history of domestic abuse is a serious dilemma for any socially conscious fan. What's more, some have wondered whether Lennon's violent tendencies also applied to his son Julian. Julian himself has neither confirmed nor denied these suspicions, though he has noted that he considers his father a hypocrite who never showed him and his mother the love and peace he was preaching to everyone else.
I can say, think peace, but it's up to them what to do.
In the summer of 1973, Lennon's marriage with Yoko Ono was in trouble. The couple were reeling from the commercial and critical disappointment of their album sometime in New York City. Ono has said that the constant hate their union drew was slowly ruining their careers. She wanted a break from the idea that she broke up the Beatles, and she needed one from Lennon as well. Her solution was to set her husband up with a mistress. The couple had an assistant named May Pang, whom Ono trusted and who she knew Lennon was attracted to, so she proposed that the pair should start an affair. Unfortunately, Lennon's vision of the affair was rather overindulgent. He and Pang ran off to Los Angeles, where Lennon started giving in to his worst habits, which included drinking heavily and generally behaving like a rock star for almost 2 years before he and Ono decided to start anew in 1975. While Lennon completed no less than 3 albums during this period known as the Lost Weekend, the creative process was usually booze-filled and bizarre. It probably didn't help that one album, 1975's Rock and Roll, was produced by a very unpredictable Phil Spector, who often turned up in outlandish costumes and once even fired a gun into the ceiling. Lennon's most famous foils might have been his bandmate Paul McCartney and the concept of war, but he had 2 other adversaries who were arguably even more powerful: President Richard Nixon and the FBI. Around 1971, the Bureau took a dislike to the musician's political activism and started waging a 5-year war against him. The federal file on Lennon was opened when he performed at a rally for John Sinclair of the White Panthers, who had recently been handed a 10-year jail sentence for selling 2 marijuana joints. Fortunately for Sinclair, he was soon released, but unfortunately for Lennon, his appearance at the rally put him in the FBI's bad books, which was a really bad place to be for someone who had recently moved to New York City. The American government harassed Lennon for years, collecting a 300-page file on him and trying to deport him on a semi-regular basis. According to the book Gimme Some Truth, the John Lennon FBI Files, President Nixon had a hand in this as he thought Lennon's political activism might endanger his re-election prospects. In the end, however, Lennon was able to weather the storm. When the Watergate scandal brought Nixon to his knees and forced him to resign in 1974, the pressure against Lennon eased up, and in 1976 he was finally able to secure a green card.
I don't expect to be, hassled unless I'm going to Hungary or something, or Czechoslovakia. Then I'd expect it.
The Beatles probably aren't the first group you would suspect of plagiarism. Nevertheless, Lennon was once accused of getting a little too inspired by another song. The song of his that drew plagiarism accusations was Come Together, a standout track on Abbey Road and one of the Fab Four's most famous tunes. According to the lawsuit by music producer Morris Levy, Lennon plagiarized Come Together from Chuck Berry's 1956 song You Can't Catch Me. While Lennon did admit that he drew inspiration from Berry's song, Levy claimed that Lennon had actually just slowed down You Can't Catch Me and presented the end result as his own. Allegedly, Lennon even stole some of the lyrics, as both songs contain a very similar line. Lennon's version goes, "Here come old flat top, he come grooving up slowly." Meanwhile, Berry's went, "Here come a flat top, he was moving up with me." Lennon settled the suit out of court, and he spent the next few years feuding with Levy over specifics in the agreement. Levy took Lennon to court for failing to record one of the 3 songs that the settlement agreement required the Beatles to record for Levy, and Lennon later returned the favor when Levy released a bootleg album featuring Lennon's old recordings. It's impossible to talk about the many tragedies in John Lennon's life without mentioning how it all ended. He was tragically assassinated by a man named Mark David Chapman, who gunned down the 40-year-old musician in front of his own home on December 8, 1980. Weirdly, this wasn't the first time Lennon and Chapman's paths intertwined. On roughly 4:30 p.m. of that same day, a young fan approached Lennon on the street. The ex-Beatle signed the Double Fantasy album the fan was holding, and his friend snapped a few photos of the two together. That fan turned out to be Chapman, who would send 5 hollow point bullets at the artist a little over 6 hours later while still holding the signed album. Chapman targeted Lennon simply because he was famous, and he admitted that his motivation was attention. He was inspired by the J.D. Salinger novel The Catcher in the Rye, and he went through with the deed despite the kindness that Lennon had showed him. Chapman has claimed since that he now regrets his crime.
The murder of John Lennon in December 1980 sent shockwaves around the world. 1980 was also a crucial year for Lennon, who'd emerged from a 5-year hiatus ready to make music once again. This is what the final 12 months of John Lennon's life were like. In 1975, 5 tumultuous years after the breakup of the Beatles, Lennon and his second wife Yoko Ono withdrew from the public eye. This was to concentrate on raising his second son, Sean. Lennon had made many mistakes in the raising of his first child, Julian, who was born in 1963 at the height of Beatlemania. In attempting to raise Julian, John was often absent and emotionally distant, as interviews from the last year of his life addressed candidly. Lennon had worked non-stop throughout his 20s in the Beatles and had claimed that every moment of the band members' lives were planned out for them, especially while they were on the touring circuit. But the early 70s hadn't allowed for much time to slow down either. Lennon had pursued a successful solo career, starting with the John Lennon Plastic Ono Band in 1970. He contributed music to albums by Ringo Starr, collaborated with Elton John in 1974 on Whatever Gets You Through the Night, and co-wrote and performed on David Bowie's Fame in 1975. With the birth of Sean, though, Lennon withdrew from the music that had dominated his life. He claimed in his final interview with Rolling Stone that he didn't write a single song for 5 years.
Stay in bed and grow your hair. Thank you.
In his return to the limelight in fall of 1980, John Lennon explained that since the birth of Sean, he had taken up the role of house husband. In an interview with Playboy, Lennon explained, "It was more important to face myself and to face that reality than to continue a life of rock and roll." The 1970s had been a decade of contrast for Lennon, the early years of which were characterized by the acrimony of the Beatles splitting and the hedonism of his 18-month-long Lost Weekend, during which he and Yoko separated and Lennon joined the ranks of Hellraiser's Harry Nilsson and Keith Moon as a habitual drinker and drug taker. So Lennon's return in 1980, after 5 years of domestic normality, represented the rebalancing of numerous aspects of his life and his reemergence to the music industry on his own terms. John and Yoko often made decisions using tarot cards, and one such reading in the spring of 1980 told them that John was to take a long journey southeast. At the time, Lennon, Ono, and Sean were living in Long Island, New York, from which the island of Bermuda lies 700 miles southeast. The family settled on Bermuda as their destination and home for the summer of 1980, and most notably of all, John and Sean made the journey by sea. On the journey, Lennon, as the least experienced sailor, spent much of the time making food for the rest of the crew. But the story goes that after a battling gale had laid many of the more experienced crew down with seasickness, Lennon took the helm, guiding the vessel through the storm. This was reportedly a transformational and cleansing moment for Lennon. The family encountered a stable and hospitable environment in Bermuda, allowing Lennon to recapture his creative muse during the 2 months he and his family remained on the island. It was in Bermuda that Lennon would begin to write his first songs in 5 years, tragically also the final material of his career. One thing that Lennon's past half-decade had been missing was nightlife, and the songwriter's familiarity with contemporary music had certainly waned during his hiatus. Exploring the night spots along Front Street in the city of Hamilton in Bermuda, Lennon claimed that he stumbled across a young group dancing to music he'd never heard before. The song in question was Rock Lobster by the B-52s, released in April 1978. In his final interview with Rolling Stone, Lennon claimed that he had never heard the song before, but said that it immediately made him think of Yoko's music. Ono was more familiar than her husband with the movements that had emerged in popular music in the late 70s, and the realization that things were changing apparently gave Lennon the inspiration he needed to begin writing music again. He started playing the guitar again the very next day.
And that's about when my life changed, really.
Not only was Bermuda important in the final year of John Lennon's life in that it helped him return to music, but it also helped him break new ground in his creative process. He was now writing music for the first time in his adult life without the aid of either drugs or alcohol. One of the songs written in Bermuda addresses this aspect of Lennon's changing habits directly. Cleanup Time, which would be recorded in the fall of 1980, is a title derived from a conversation Lennon had with the producer Jack Douglas. The two discussed how many of their friends and acquaintances were attempting to clean up their acts after the excesses of the 1970s. Lennon came back from Bermuda re-energized and ready to emerge from a self-imposed hiatus. Packing his first collection of new material in half a decade, Lennon began to assemble the team of musicians and producers who would help him turn the rough ideas he'd outlined in Bermuda into studio takes for his return to mainstream music. However, the newly well-balanced Lennon was not out to prove anything. Instead, his attitude was just to enjoy the process. Studio sessions began at New York's famous Hit Factory studio. The sessions also included many songs written by Yoko Ono, some of which Lennon would include on the Double Fantasy album. The nature of Lennon's comeback was writ large in the title of his first single in 5 years. Just Like Starting Over is a sweet single that adequately reflects the unity of his relationship with Ono in the years preceding its release. The song's opening bars evoke the theme of rebirth and the trepidation of returning to something, in this case the music scene, which is not as familiar as it once was. The song is in fact constructed from 3 fragments, with the first section, originally titled My Life, emerging in 1979 as a love song that John had penned for Yoko. 2 unfinished pieces, previously known as Don't Be Crazy and The Worst Is Over, make up the remaining parts, while the song only came together in its final form once Lennon and Ono had begun working in the studio in New York. On release, the singles peaked in the top 10 in both the UK and the US singles charts, marking an end to Lennon's self-imposed hiatus and signaling that he still had a receptive following as an artist. The single was to become his biggest solo hit in the US after his death. The studio sessions in New York yielded an album within 2 months, the same period of time that Lennon had spent rediscovering his creative energies on the island of Bermuda. Double Fantasy, released November 17, 1980, echoed the structure of how the songs were first written and shared between John and Yoko, in which a song sung by one of them would influence the other to respond with another song. So in the track listing, you have Lennon singing I'm Losing You, to which Ono responds with the song I'm Moving On. Despite such tensions providing much of the drama of the album, the lyrics are permeated with images of cozy domesticity and marital bliss, which many reviewers at the time took issue with. In fact, the response to the album upon its release was, to put it mildly, mixed, with the record's domestic themes and Lennon's apparent happiness being bones of contention for many critics. In hindsight, however, these revealing elements have come to show Lennon's state of mind in his final days, and tragically, Double Fantasy seemed to suggest that by 1980, Lennon may have finally found happiness. From the breakup of the Beatles in 1970, John Lennon and Paul McCartney had a tense and rocky relationship, beginning with the two taking shots at one another on records and in numerous early solo interviews. Lennon had taken issue with some of the lyrics on Paul and Linda McCartney's 1971 album Ram, which he interpreted as being about his relationship with Yoko Ono. McCartney would later confirm to Playboy that the song Too Many People was indeed about John and Yoko, and that the latter's name was in the original lyrics before being edited out. On John's side, the vicious How Do You Sleep from Imagine, released the same year as Ram, could hardly be about anyone else. By the mid to late 70s, however, the duo had begun to mend their friendship. The pair had reunited only a couple of times since, once in 1974 and again in 1976, when they spent an evening together watching an episode of Saturday Night Live in which Lorne Michaels jokingly offered the Beatles $3,000 to appear on the show. The two joked about turning up at the studio. Lennon and McCartney last spoke on John Lennon's 40th birthday, October 9, 1980, a phone call that McCartney later described as happy. On the day of his death 2 months later, Lennon reportedly told journalist Dave Sholin that McCartney was, quote, like a brother.
We have communicated over the phone in the last year, Paul and I, often.
It seems that John Lennon's claim that he and Yoko Ono had something to say on their return wasn't just empty rhetoric. If anything, it was as if the well of words had refilled itself in the years that Lennon had been away from the spotlight. In addition to the songs and musical ideas, the idea that Lennon had rediscovered his voice in Bermuda is also evidenced by the slew of interviews and public appearances that Lennon made in the months before his death. In September, the couple gave a long interview to Playboy that covered all aspects of their careers, from the early days to what their working routines were like in 1980, as well as their family life and opinions about Lennon's former bandmates and contemporaries. On Friday, December 5, 1980, 3 days before his murder, Lennon was interviewed at his Upper West Side apartment by Rolling Stone editor Jonathan Kotz for a full 9 hours. The interview was only published years later. Instead, Kott tragically ended up writing Lennon's obituary, drawing on impressions of the musician from over a decade of wide-ranging interviews and meetings. The horror of Lennon's murder, which was committed publicly in front of his wife by an obsessive fan who he'd spoken to and signed a record for earlier the same day, requires no detailed explanation. The tragedy of his death at the age of 40, in the light of what we know about his life immediately beforehand, is, however, worth talking about. Lennon was publicly active at the time, promoting a new album, meeting fans, and returning to the studio to work on more music when his life was taken from him. Having taken steps to address aspects of his life, his past behaviors, and his turn away from music in favor of family, the truth is that perhaps, as many of his interviews in 1980 show, Lennon's life was perfectly balanced and he was approaching music and fame on his own terms. And the peaceful space that he had created for himself and his family in his hiatus allowed him to think about his future, a far cry from the Beatlemania days when life was moving fast at the behest of managers and executives. The outpouring of grief following Lennon's murder made his final album a massive commercial success, and it eventually won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year. Lennon's death meant that the album's intimate themes and lyrics became insights into his final months, while for many, the Grammy that the album received stands as a memorial to an artist who just wanted to keep creating. Just like Starting Over hit #1 in both the UK and US after his death, staying at the top of the Billboard 100 for 5 weeks.
The relationship between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, the Beatles' principal songwriters, continues to capture audiences' imaginations. This is the true story of their roller coaster friendship, from its humble beginnings to its tragic end. The cultural landscape in which the two key Beatles songwriters met was very different from that in which they rose to prominence in the early 1960s. The year was 1957, and John Lennon was the lead singer and guitarist in a ragtag teen band called the Quarrymen. The group was named after Quarrybank High School in Liverpool, where the 16-year-old Lennon and his bandmates were all classmates. And while the early music of the Beatles would be predominantly rock and roll, the Quarrymen's stock in trade was skiffle, a pre-rock folk and blues genre. On July 6th of that year, the Quarrymen had a gig at a church fete, or festival, on the outskirts of Liverpool, performing on the same bill as a dog show and a traditional brass band. In the bustling crowd that day was Paul McCartney, then aged just 15. McCartney, having been introduced to the band, impressed the group of older teens with his musicianship by playing a string of rock and roll songs on his guitar. It wasn't long before McCartney was invited to join the group and petitioned for the recruitment of another talented young musician, George Harrison. On July 15, 1958, just over a year after he met Paul McCartney for the first time, John Lennon lost his mother, Julia, in a traffic accident. Though he didn't live with Julia, Lennon adored his mom. She had introduced him to rock and roll and enthusiastically taught him his first chords on the guitar, which she bought for him. Her death crushed the young Lennon, who began to act out more than he ever had before. But in Paul McCartney, he had found a kindred spirit. The younger Beatles' own mother had died of breast cancer when McCartney was 14. McCartney told Rolling Stone, "So we had a kind of bond that we both knew about that. We knew that feeling." While Lennon would later write songs such as Julia and Mother that directly addressed his sense of loss, McCartney would never consciously write about his mother in a Lennon-McCartney song. However, McCartney later admitted that his mother's death would have spurred him on as a songwriter. McCartney told Stephen Colbert in 2019,
"And I never thought it affected my music until years later. I certainly didn't mean it to be, but it could be."
Famously, any Beatles song written by either John Lennon or Paul McCartney was listed as a Lennon-McCartney composition, a tradition that was maintained throughout the band's existence. The decision was made very early on, back when the pair were taking their first steps to becoming songwriters. In the book, All We Are Saying, which featured one of the final interviews Lennon gave during his lifetime, the singer told journalist David Sheff, "We always had that thing that our names would go on songs even if we didn't write them. It was never a legal deal between Paul and me, just an agreement to put both our names on our songs." Even in 1969, when the Beatles were starting to record and perform with other artists, the pull of the old co-credit was still strong. Lennon also admitted in All We Are Saying that his anti-war anthem, Give Peace a Chance, was actually written in collaboration with his wife Yoko Ono. However, the song was still credited to Lennon and McCartney on the record. Old habits die hard. More recently, McCartney received some criticism for attempting to change the iconic credit and to have songs he penned alone listed as McCartney-Lennon compositions on his later solo and live albums. However, McCartney eventually backed down, telling The Guardian, "I'm happy with the way it is and always has been. Lennon and McCartney is still the rock and roll trademark I'm proud to be a part of, in the order it has always been." In the early days of their friendship, John Lennon and Paul McCartney were inseparable, writing compulsively, quote, eyeball to eyeball, as Lennon described to Playboy in 1980. But to suppose that Lennon and McCartney's bond was established purely through nerding out over chord progressions and strumming patterns would be way off. Around the same time, the Beatles' manager, Brian Epstein, had the up-and-coming group booked for hectic gig schedules, including lengthy residencies in Hamburg's notorious red light district, as well as becoming a top-notch live act thanks to thousands of hours spent on stage performing together night after night. The Beatles also grew together through a shared indulgence in Hamburg's riotous nightlife, copious alcohol, and sex. Additionally, most of the bandmates' extracurricular activities occurred at close quarters, seeing as the near-penniless Beatles shared hotel rooms and bunk beds during their time in Hamburg. The incredible intimacy between the band members was key to their legendary chemistry. McCartney told GQ, "In music, it made us a very tight band, but as friends, it made us able to read each other when we were super close." The Lennon-McCartney partnership scored its first big hit in the UK in October 1962 with Love Me Do. 3 months later, they released Please Please Me, their first chart topper which heralded the start of Beatlemania. Today, the story of the Beatles is looked back on in its entirety as a 7-year-long recording miracle. But 50 years on, the immediacy of Lennon and McCartney's success as songwriters is perhaps easy to overlook. In 1966, music critic Michael Lydon published a profile of the Beatles in which he explored the incredible popularity of their songs, whether performed by the Fab Four or others. Lydon wrote, "By February 1st, 1966, the 88 Lennon-McCartney songs had been recorded in 2,921 versions. Versions by the Beatles have by now sold close to 200 million record tracks. Total sales of all Lennon-McCartney recorded compositions must be pushing 500 million. Lennon and McCartney were barely halfway through their collaboration." The year 1967 was a transformative one for the Beatles, the decisive period in which the friendly rivalry that propelled the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership to the highest possible critical and commercial heights began to disintegrate. May of that year saw the release of the band's landmark album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which some critics have argued is the band's most iconic and representative work, not to mention a release that has become indelibly linked to the 60s counterculture. But Sgt. Pepper also signaled the moment Lennon and McCartney's interests started to diverge, and the power struggle between the two, which would complicate the final years of the band, began. As Rolling Stone notes, the concept album was primarily McCartney's idea, whose role in the group was expanding as Lennon found himself in crisis, withdrawing from the world amid the last turbulent months of his unhappy first marriage. Lennon later commented, "I was still in a real big depression in Pepper, and I know Paul wasn't at that time. He was feeling full of confidence. I was going through murder." Though the Sgt. Pepper tune, A Day in the Life, represents one of the greatest successes in the Lennon-McCartney partnership, the song is emblematic of their increasingly separate songwriting, being a combination of two different compositions. As time went on, it became obvious that Lennon and McCartney's eyeball-to-eyeball songwriting style of the early 60s would never be revisited. As the 1960s wore on, the Beatles were wearing out. As noted by Rolling Stone, in 1968, both John Lennon and Paul McCartney were creating some of their greatest work during the making of the band's famously sprawling White Album. However, the creative directions that the songwriters were going in began to deviate significantly, as did their personal lives. Lennon, head over heels in love and beginning a whirlwind romance with his new partner Yoko Ono, became alienated amid a growing heroin addiction, according to Beatles' Bible. But when the band's breakup finally hit the papers in April 1970, it seemed to have all been Paul McCartney's doing. Seemingly out of nowhere, McCartney announced that the Beatles were no longer making music together and that he was going solo. Lennon was quick to characterize McCartney's actions as a betrayal. However, McCartney wasn't the first to leave the band. In fact, he was the last. Lennon had announced he was leaving a year earlier, while George and Ringo had each walked out earlier than that. But in terms of PR, it was McCartney who took the hit for the end of the Beatles. While Paul McCartney's announcement that the Beatles were no more certainly meant he attracted plenty of ire from fans and critics alike, it managed to enrage John Lennon in that it inherently suggested that McCartney was the band's de facto leader. Lennon declared to the press at the time, "I started the band. I disbanded it. It's as simple as that." But the war of words didn't just occur through the press, it was also waged on wax. In 1971, McCartney released Ram, his second album with his wife Linda. The album contained the song Too Many People, which Lennon interpreted as a swipe against him and Yoko Ono. Lennon hit back with the brutal How Do You Sleep, which features the line, "Those freaks was right when they said you was dead." The lyric was a reference to the long-standing urban myth that McCartney died in the early 60s and had been replaced by an imposter. For many, the disunity that characterized the post-Beatles relationship was symbolic of the end of the 60s counterculture, something that Lennon himself noted in his 1970 Rolling Stone interview. "I don't believe in it. The dream is over. I'm not just talking about the Beatles. I'm talking about the generation thing. It's over." The only record on which John Lennon and Paul McCartney can be heard playing together after the dissolution of the Beatles is a bootleg that poorly received A Toot and a Snore in '74, a recording of a drug-fueled jam session. Pitchfork recently called the record atrocious. But the fact that the two most bitterly at odds former Beatles were in the same room and finally making music together again is a testament to the fact that by the mid-70s, the animosity between Lennon and McCartney was finally beginning to dissipate. In interviews from around 1974 and 1975, Lennon was relaxed enough about his relationship with McCartney to openly discuss the idea of a Beatles reunion, even admitting that he would, quote, "go along with it if someone else organized it."
I haven't worked with Paul because we had a more difficult time, but now we're pretty close.
Although Lennon and McCartney never did work together again, it wasn't a conscious decision. Rather, the chance just never arose. Lennon effectively retired from music for 5 years in 1975 to care for his newborn son, Sean, while McCartney claimed it was, quote, pot and politics that meant he was unable to reconnect fully with his former songwriting partner in his final years. McCartney was banned from entering America due to drug offenses, while Lennon and his young family were splitting their time between Los Angeles and New York. John Lennon was killed in the street in New York on December 8, 1980. He was 40 years old and had recently returned to the public eye with the release of his first album in 5 years. In a now infamous clip, McCartney, who had spent the day following Lennon's death in a London studio, tells the assorted press outside,
Drag, isn't it?
The comment received plenty of criticism, but McCartney was in shock. He later explained, "I was home and I got a phone call. It was early in the morning. It was just so horrific. I couldn't take it in, and I couldn't take it in." In 2020, McCartney described how, even today, he still recalls the dynamic of his time with Lennon, when, eyeball to eyeball, they created some of popular music's best-loved tunes, and noted how thankful he was that the two rivals had patched up their relationship before Lennon's tragic death. McCartney told the Times of London, "We had certainly got our friendship back, which was a great blessing for me, and I now will often think, if I'm writing a song, okay, John, I'll toss it over to you. What line comes next?"
At the height of his success with the Beatles and as a solo artist, John Lennon was one of the most influential people in the world. However, no one could have expected that in December 1980, Lennon would be the target of a murder. Here are the details. After spending more than a decade with the Beatles and the first half of the 1970s as a successful solo artist, John Lennon took a step back from music after the birth of his second child, Sean. Eventually, Lennon returned to music with the album Double Fantasy, released in November 1980. Double Fantasy was a commercial success when it was released, but critics panned the album. An NME critic said that Lennon should have, quote, kept his big happy trap shut. The inspiration for the album came from a boat trip Lennon and his family took that summer of 1980. Lennon and 4-year-old Sean took a boat from Newport, Rhode Island to Bermuda. While on holiday, Lennon's songwriting inspiration returned to him for the first time in 5 years, and he wrote 30 songs. While in Bermuda, he met artist Nancy Gosnell, who drew a portrait of Lennon and his son. Lennon loved the painting. According to Gosnell, he also spoke openly about his past, his relationship with Ono and the other Beatles, and asked for the name of Gosnell's teacher in New York to assist his own artwork. Ultimate Classic Rock says that while the initial critical reception for Double Fantasy was harsh, the negative reviews disappeared following his murder, and the album went on to win the Grammy for Album of the Year. While the birth of Sean Lennon in 1975 prompted the music icon to put down his guitar and become a father, the birth of his first son, Julian Lennon, in 1963 had the opposite reaction. John Lennon was on the road during Julian's birth, and it took 3 days for the father to meet his son. This episode encapsulated the early relationship between father and son. The Irish Times reports that at one point in Julian's young life, John said this to Julian: "Sean was the product of love, you were the product of a whiskey bottle." Julian understandably grew angry at his father during his life, speaking to John only sporadically for the better part of a decade. Only at the insistence of his mother and John's first wife, Cynthia Powell, did Julian begin to open up more to his father. Paul McCartney said of his old friend, "John never really knew how to be a dad." It was McCartney, not his father, that taught young Julian how to first play guitar, and McCartney wrote the song Hey Jude to lift Julian's spirits during his parents' divorce. Julian was living in North Wales when his father was murdered across the Atlantic. In a Q&A session, Julian recalled waking up to the paparazzi outside his house. He instinctively knew what had happened, but he had to wait for his mother to return from London to officially get the news.
I felt I had to go to New York to see it for myself. I had to witness it.
Forever remembered as the man who killed John Lennon, Mark David Chapman's disturbing mental state can only in part tell the story of how and why he killed Lennon. Chapman was born on May 10, 1955 in Fort Worth, Texas. His father was a U.S. Air Force sergeant and his mother was a nurse. At the age of 16, Chapman became a born-again Christian. However, this did not improve his mental health, and in 1977, after moving to Hawaii, he attempted suicide. 2 years later, Chapman was working as a security guard and married a travel agent named Gloria Abe. Still, Chapman's mental state was an issue. Following Lennon's murder, Chapman was diagnosed with depression, suicidal tendencies, and schizophrenia. Lennon was not Chapman's first target. According to the New York Post, Chapman had considered assassinating Presidents Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. Lennon was chosen by Chapman as he felt the artist's wealth and success had made him a fraud. His justification came in part through J.D. Salinger's novel The Catcher in the Rye, and the connection he felt he had with its main character, Holden Caulfield. John Lennon's final day began at 11 a.m. when Rolling Stone magazine photographer Annie Leibovitz arrived for a photo shoot with John and Yoko. The session produced the iconic picture of a naked Lennon holding and kissing his fully clothed wife on the cheek. After the shoot, the couple participated in an interview with radio personality Dave Sholin around 12:40 p.m. Less than an hour prior, Mark David Chapman arrived outside of Lennon's home, the Dakota Apartments, and spoke with a friend of Lennon, freelance photographer Paul Gorish. Speaking to Behind the Music, Gorish remembered Chapman being a jerk and holding a copy of Double Fantasy. Around 4:30 p.m., Lennon and Ono left to work on a new single, Walking on Thin Ice, and ran into Chapman and Gorish. Lennon signed Chapman's copy of the album, and Gorish snapped a photo of the two individuals. Finishing up their song hours later, Geffen Records founder David Geffen told the couple that Double Fantasy had sold gold. The pair left the studio in high spirits around 10:30 p.m. and arrived at the Dakota a little before 11 p.m. Ono got out of the car first, and Lennon followed right behind her, noticing Chapman but not paying any mind to him. Chapman pulled out a .38 handgun and fired 5 shots, hitting Lennon 4 times in his back and chest. Officers arrived at the Dakota Apartments only minutes after the shooting. Once they arrived, the doorman quickly pointed out Mark David Chapman, who was simply standing and waiting for the officers to arrive. Chapman was then quickly arrested by officers Peter Cullen and Steve Spiro.
I turned to him and I said, you just threw your whole damn life away.
Lennon struggled up 5 steps before collapsing. He was covered in his own blood and unrecognizable to arriving officers. Officers Herb Frauenberger and Tony Palma were the first to see Lennon, and when Frauenberger turned his head to check his pulse, he noticed who it was. The officers put Lennon into the car of another arriving officer, James Moran, who took him to Roosevelt Hospital, while Frauenberger followed with Yoko in his car. At the Roosevelt, Dr. Stephen Lynn headed the emergency surgery that desperately attempted to save Lennon's life. According to Lynn, Lennon arrived with no pulse and 3 gunshot wounds in the left upper chest. Lynn also went on to say, "If Mr. Lennon was shot in the midst of a cardiac operating room with a cardiac operating room team standing by all ready to fix his wounds, I don't think they would have been able to save him." John Lennon, 40 years old, was pronounced dead at 11:07 p.m.
This evening, John Lennon arrived at the emergency room at the Roosevelt Hospital. He was dead at the time of his arrival.
In the age before social media and 24-hour news coverage, any information of John Lennon's murder would normally not have come out until the following morning. However, because of an individual who so happened to be at the right place at the right time, Lennon's murder was announced that night on a national broadcast football game to millions around the country. On December 9, 1974, 6 years and a day earlier, Lennon had been a celebrity guest on Monday Night Football and was interviewed by broadcaster Howard Cosell. On December 8, 1980, Cosell was broadcasting the game between the New England Patriots and Miami Dolphins on ABC. That night, Alan Weiss, a local WABC news producer, was involved in a motorcycle accident and was getting treatment at the Roosevelt. He overheard the officers mentioning Lennon. In a moment that has been dramatized in film, he immediately got up and told his assignment editor what he heard. After confirming the news with his doctor, the information moved up the chain of commands to the broadcast team. During a commercial break, Cosell and his co-broadcaster Frank Gifford discussed what to do. Cosell, who was friends with Lennon, questioned whether or not to say anything, but Gifford believed it was important to get the information out to the unknowing public. With 3 seconds left in the game, tied 13-13, Cosell announced to the audience that Lennon had been shot and killed.
Rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, dead on arrival.
Miami would win the game in overtime, but the result was far from people's minds that night or the next morning. The Beatles reached unprecedented levels of global popularity and are still seen as the greatest musical act of all time. After a publicized breakup in 1970, there were lingering questions about the band members' relationships. The 3 surviving members all had different reactions to the death of their friend and leader. Ringo Starr spoke to Barbara Walters in 1981 about John Lennon's murder. Starr saw Lennon less than a month before his death and learned about it from his stepdaughter, who told him, quote, "John's been shot." Originally believing the shot only injured him, Starr was shocked to learn that the attack killed him. Speaking to Rolling Stone magazine in 2019, Starr said upon arriving in New York, he played games with Sean Lennon at the request of Yoko Ono. Paul McCartney, despite being the closest to Lennon growing up, was initially criticized for his response. After being cornered by media for his reaction, McCartney ended the interview by saying, "Drag, isn't it?" McCartney's response to Lennon's death prompted many to feel that his words were callous. McCartney said that he had trouble dealing with the reality of his friend's murder and told NME that he still cries about it 4 decades later. In a 1990 interview, George Harrison recalled the last time he saw his old bandmate. He came over to Lennon's house for dinner in 1978, and the pair listened to Indian music. However, in August 1980, Harrison released an autobiography that barely mentioned Lennon, which hurt him. The pair never reconciled before Lennon's murder. John Lennon's murder ended any chances of the Fab Four getting back together for any future shows or albums. That being said, the 1970s saw plenty of opportunities for reunions, as members still worked together on each other's music. However, the most famous quasi-reunion almost occurred on Saturday Night Live. In 1976, the show's producer Lorne Michaels looked directly in the camera and made an offer of $3,000 for the Beatles to reunite on their show and perform 3 songs. Little did Michaels and the SNL cast know that less than 2 miles away, Lennon and Paul McCartney were watching the show at Lennon's Dakota apartment and talked briefly about heading down to the studio to perform as a joke. However, the pair agreed that they were tired and did not want to work on a relaxing night off. The former members of the Beatles would, throughout the 1970s, work on each other's albums, but never reunite together as a foursome. The band's initial reaction to the breakup, at least for Lennon and McCartney, was to attack each other on songs. According to Rolling Stone, McCartney's song Too Many People took shots at Lennon, who responded with the song How Do You Sleep, featuring George Harrison on guitar. It was not until the Beatles anthology in 1995 that the 3 surviving members reunited to make new music. Charged with murder in the second degree, Mark David Chapman underwent psychiatric testing where he was diagnosed as a schizophrenic by a doctor. The diagnosis, coupled with his obsession with J.D. Salinger's novel The Catcher in the Rye, his previous attempt to kill himself, and not fleeing the scene, led many to believe he would use an insanity defense. Chapman once again surprised the world by pleading guilty, saying it was what God would want from him. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He has been eligible for parole since 2000, but has been denied every time, to Yoko Ono's appreciation. In a 2015 interview with People, Ono revealed that she does not really think about Chapman. Chapman and his wife Gloria had written to Ono for forgiveness, but she has always opposed his parole. And so far, Chapman has been denied parole 11 times. An apology to police, 4 infamous words, and 1 #1 dance hit. The death of John Lennon was one of the most notorious moments of the 20th century, but there are some things about it you still don't know. Keep watching for the details. Mark David Chapman was nothing if not troubled, but John Lennon might still be alive today if his killer hadn't come across a pair of books. The first, J.D. Salinger's classic Catcher in the Rye, which Chapman was famously obsessed with, identifying strongly with its iconoclast main character Holden Caulfield. The second, John Lennon One Day at a Time, a biographical work by author Anthony Fawcett. Chapman recalled during a 2000 parole hearing that the book solidified his opinion of Lennon, that he was a hypocrite, a phony who sang about imagining no possessions while living the luxurious life of a rock star.
I just saw him as a two-dimensional celebrity with no real feelings.
Chapman described how he had flown to New York several months before the shooting, intending to kill the Beatle, but managed to talk himself out of it. But then he said, "The urges started building in me again to do this crime, and I flew back to New York on December 6th and checked into a hotel. And then on the day of December 8th, stayed outside the Dakota waiting for him with intent to shoot and kill him." Chapman wasn't alone either. There was usually a small contingent of fans milling around outside the Dakota. He would later tell CNN that as he was engaged in conversation, he missed Lennon getting out of a cab and entering the building. Not long after, legendary Rolling Stone photographer Annie Leibovitz arrived to finish work on a photo shoot for the magazine, which had been brewing a cover story about John Lennon's return to music after a brief hiatus. She later told Smithsonian Magazine, "John came to the door in a black leather jacket and he had his hair slicked back. I was thrown a little bit by it. He had that early Beatle look." Leibovitz was going for a striking image, but also on her mind was the cover of Lennon and Yoko Ono's new album Double Fantasy, which featured a simple black and white photo of the couple kissing. At first, she pitched the idea of photographing the couple naked, but when Ono balked, she came up with another idea, a shot of a naked Lennon holding a fully clothed Ono. She took a Polaroid version of the shot as a test, and Lennon was immediately sold on the idea. The image, of course, has become iconic, not only as a brilliant encapsulation of the relationship between the pair, but as the last professional photo of Lennon ever taken. After the shoot, John Lennon gave an interview to Dave Sholin of RKO Radio that was intended for use on a syndicated radio show. Lennon spoke with the interviewer for nearly 2 hours. Ironically, he expressed optimism for the new decade. Lennon said, "I hope the young kids like Double Fantasy as well, but I'm really talking to the people who grew up with me and saying, here I am now. How are you? Wasn't the 70s a drag, you know? Here we are. Well, let's try to make the 80s good, you know? Because it's still up to us to make what we can of it." Lennon also offered a frank and foreboding assessment of his work as a musician to that point. He said, "I always considered my work one piece, whether it be with the Beatles, David Bowie, Elton John, Yoko Ono, and I consider that my work won't be finished until I'm dead and buried, and I hope that's a long, long time." After the interview had concluded, Lennon asked Sholin for a lift to the record plant recording studio, where he hoped to get in some work on a new song. Sholin agreed, but as they left the Dakota, Lennon had a fateful encounter with what appeared to be an autograph-seeking fan. As John Lennon exited the Dakota, he was met by Paul Gorish, an amateur photographer who had previously snapped some pictures of him. As Gorish was showing Lennon his proofs, Mark Chapman approached, not with a gun in his hand, but a copy of Double Fantasy for Lennon to sign. At another parole hearing in 2012, Chapman described what sounded like a pleasant, if awkward, encounter. He said, "He was very kind to me. The limousine was waiting. His wife was waiting in the limousine, and he took his time with me, and he got the pen going, and he signed my album. He asked me if I needed anything else. I said, no sir, and he walked away. Very cordial and very decent man." When asked if the encounter had given him pause in his plan to shoot Lennon, Chapman said that it had, but only briefly. He remembered, "There was an inner struggle for a while there, you know, what am I doing here? I did try to tell myself to leave, but I was so compelled to commit that murder that nothing would have dragged me away from that building." The song that John Lennon and Yoko Ono went off to work on was one that had been sticking in Lennon's craw for some time, Walking on Thin Ice, a dancey track with Ono on lead vocals. Its prolonged gestation in the studio meant that it had missed the cutoff for the November release of Double Fantasy, but the sessions on the song had been reignited a week or so prior. Lennon spent the evening tweaking the mix on the song with helper producer Jack Douglas, and by the evening's end, they had a mix that the musician was happy with. In fact, he remarked that Ono had just cut her first #1 single, and he was later proven right when a remixed version of the song hit the top of the US dance charts in 2003. For its initial release in February 1981, Ono penned a touching tribute in the liner notes. It read, "Getting this together after what happened was hard, but I knew John would not rest his mind if I hadn't. I hope you like it, John. I did my best." After completing the mix at about 10:30 p.m., John Lennon decided to call it quits. He suggested that he and Yoko Ono should grab a bite to eat before heading home, and by all accounts, the pair arrived back at the Dakota about 10:45 p.m. For an unknown reason, the pair elected to use an entrance on a side street next to the lobby attendant's office rather than the main courtyard entrance. This is where Mark Chapman was waiting. According to witnesses and the killer's own recollection of the event to CNN, Mark Chapman stood up, called out Mr. Lennon, and fired 5 hollow-point rounds from .38 revolver at John Lennon's back. 1 round missed, 2 struck his left shoulder, and the other 2 caused fatal damage to his left lung and the arteries above his heart.
When they went inside the gate, and then all of a sudden they heard 5-6 shots, and that was it.
Upon hearing gunfire, Yoko Ono instinctively fled around the corner, returning when she realized Lennon hadn't followed. Lennon managed to stagger onto a flight of stairs and tell the doorman he was shot. In yet another hearing before the parole board in 2019, Chapman confirmed his chilling reason for specifically using hollow-point ammunition. He said, "I secured those bullets to make sure he would be dead. It was immediately after the crime that I was concerned that he did not suffer." In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, Chapman simply stood with the empty revolver by his side, feeling a combination of calm and shock. He was approached by Norman Jose Perdomo in tears, who asked if he knew what he had done. Chapman responded, "I just shot John Lennon." Perdomo proceeded to shake the gun loose from Chapman's grip and kick it away. After that, Chapman produced his copy of The Catcher in the Rye and began calmly reading while he waited for police to arrive. On the front inside cover of the book, he had written 4 words, which have since become infamous. "This is my statement." Speaking with the New York Post in 2020, Officer Peter Cullen remembered how he and his partner Steve Spiro were greeted with a bizarre scene when they arrived at the Dakota. Mark Chapman reading, Jose Perdomo screaming, and Yoko Ono in complete hysterics. Spiro slammed Chapman against the wall to cuff him, while Cullen observed that John Lennon was in bad shape. He explained that the musician was lying face down with blood coming out of his mouth. More officers shortly arrived, 2 of whom loaded Lennon into the back of a squad car, realizing he was in no condition to wait for an ambulance. As Chapman was being arrested, Cullen recalled that he didn't put up a fight. He told the New York Post, "He apologized to us for ruining our night. I turned around and said to him, 'You've got to be f***ing kidding me. You're worried about our night? Do you know what you just did to your life?' We read him his rights more than once." Lennon was still alive when he was rushed to the hospital, but he had incurred injuries that no human being could survive for any reasonable length of time. Doctors attempted to resuscitate him for 45 minutes, but to no avail. He died en route.
Former Beatle John Lennon, who was 40, was shot and killed last night outside his luxury apartment in New York.
As John Lennon was rushed into the emergency room, one man instinctually keyed into the fact that a major story was unfolding right before him. His name was Alan Wise, a man in the hospital after a minor motorcycle crash. He also happened to be a news producer for New York's WABC TV. Wise at first assumed the gunshot victim, who was briskly wheeled past his own gurney, to be a drug dealer, until he overheard a conversation between 2 attending police officers. Speaking with the News Times in 2014, Wise recalled, "There are 2 police officers carrying a man, and they literally take him to the room that I'm laying outside of. The 2 cops come out, and they're literally standing right by my bed, over my head. And one cop says to the other, 'Can you believe it? John Lennon.'" Wise, whose head was still ringing from his own accident, wasn't sure he'd heard correctly until he spotted Yoko Ono, at which point he flew into journalist mode. Wise got on the phone with his editor, and a short time later, he was conducting a phone interview with ABC Radio. The information he imparted would soon be passed on to the ABC television network, and it wasn't until afterward that Wise began to worry that Sean Lennon would hear the news on TV and not from his mother. In 2010, though, The Guardian was able to speak with a hospital administrator at the time, who assured Wise that an information blackout had been in place until Yoko was able to deliver the news to her son.
It was so sudden, and I think that was very difficult for me.
Needless to say, Lennon's loss affected all those who loved him deeply and continues to do so to this day. His ex-bandmates, with whom he often quarreled, uniformly offered short, direct public statements that betrayed their utter shock at his death. Paul McCartney in particular has never really gotten over the death of his musical soulmate. In 2020, he told NME, "It's very difficult for me, and I occasionally will have thoughts and sort of say, I don't know, why don't I just break down crying every day? Because it's that bad." As for Lennon's millions of fans, the loss of such a distinctive, incisive artistic voice was nearly impossible to process. At Yoko Ono's request, though, they did their best. On December 14, 1980, countless fans in New York and around the world took a moment of silent prayer in his honor.
President Nixon and the FBI saw John Lennon as a threat, and the former Beatles FBI files were not released for decades. So what exactly did the Bureau have on Lennon, and why did they go after him? Here are John Lennon's FBI files explained. You could say John Lennon officially entered the political sphere during 1967's Summer of Love, when he and his new wife, Yoko Ono, spent their honeymoon in bed and invited the press to join them.
Stay in bed and grow your hair. Thank you.
Lennon's rationale for the bed-in was simple. We knew whatever we did was going to be in the papers. We decided to utilize the space we would occupy anyway by getting married with a commercial for peace. As expected, their call for world peace made international headlines. They also caught the eye of the American government. President Richard Nixon had just been inaugurated and had promised to end the Vietnam War. However, peace negotiations in Paris were slow-moving, and the public continued to put pressure on the U.S. to end the war more quickly. Meanwhile, at their hotel rooms in Amsterdam and in Montreal, Lennon and Ono entertained their own peace negotiations with everyone from rabbis and Hare Krishnas to conservative media figures. Lennon told the press during his and Yoko's bed-in, "In Paris, the Vietnam peace talks have got about as far as sorting out the shape of the table they are going to sit round. Those talks have been going on for months. In 1 week in bed, we achieved a lot more." President Richard Nixon became increasingly concerned that John Lennon would use his influence to complicate the U.S. government's efforts and reputation. At Nixon's request, the FBI began a file on Lennon, which they would later refuse to declassify, claiming that releasing the Lennon files could cause international military retaliation due to Lennon's leftist ties. It took historian and professor John Wiener 14 years to finally convince the Bureau to release the secret documents, according to an extensive NPR radio interview. Wiener later wrote a book, Gimme Some Truth, the John Lennon FBI files, about his findings. Soon after the documents were released in 1997, Mark Rosenbaum, legal director of the ACLU of Southern California, had this to say: "The release of these final documents, concealed from public view for nearly a quarter of a century, reveals government paranoia at a pathological level and an attempt to shield executive branch abuse of civil liberties under the rubric of national security." From 1971 to 1972, the FBI tracked John Lennon's activities not only due to his ties with anti-Vietnam War activist leaders, but for his songwriting. As stupid as it may sound, Nixon and many of his allies were afraid that Lennon was preaching radical ideas through his music that could lead to the downfall of America, or at least their administration. When Give Peace a Chance was released, it became a protest staple and rallying cry. Lennon began directly associating with certain left-wing activists, and Immigration and Naturalization Services moved to deport him on a bogus past drug charge. The Nixon administration claimed that Lennon had, quote, been admitted to the country improperly, and that he had pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge of marijuana possession in London in 1968. Immigration law at that time banned anyone who had a drug offense on their record from entering the U.S. Many powerful allies came to Lennon and Yoko Ono's aid, including musician powerhouses like Bob Dylan, movie stars like Tony Curtis, and best-selling authors like John Updike. Still, extradition proceedings ensued until the end of Nixon's Watergate crisis. Fortunately for Lennon and Ono, Nixon was deported from the White House before he was successful in deporting them. John Lennon became friends with key Vietnam protesters who were part of the Chicago Seven: Bobby Seale, Abby Hoffman, and Jerry Rubin. The Chicago Seven were a group of anti-Vietnam War protesters who were charged with conspiracy and the intention of inciting riots at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. In 1971, the protesters convinced Lennon and Yoko Ono to headline a political concert rally to shine a light on writer and poet John Sinclair's arrest for possession of marijuana and to criticize Nixon's policies. Sinclair was an activist from Detroit who had been part of forming the White Panther Party, a socialist group designed to support the goals of the Black Panther Party in the midst of the civil rights movement. The Free John Sinclair rally was an 8-hour-long show full of political speeches and performances by activists and artists, including Allen Ginsberg and Stevie Wonder. 15,000 people attended the show. The event also featured Sinclair himself via phone. Lennon even wrote an original song titled John Sinclair specifically for the concert. The most important thing to note about that night's events was that its organizers were ultimately successful in their goal. 48 hours after the rally, Sinclair was released from prison, and the Michigan legislature even reformed the state's marijuana laws in order to free him. John Wiener told NPR that he eventually obtained John Lennon's FBI files thanks to the Freedom of Information Act. He also discussed the agents on the investigation's incompetence, referring to them as more, quote, Keystone cops than the Gestapo. For example, a wanted poster of Lennon was produced at some stage, but the photo the FBI used wasn't even his. It was actually an image of David Peel, a folk singer and street performer in the East Village. The photo was from an album cover that Lennon had produced titled The Pope Smokes Dope. Lennon, who was undoubtedly one of the most recognizable faces in the world at the time, was ultimately mistaken for a local busker. Perhaps it was fortunate for Lennon that the Bureau's investigation was less than sophisticated. Once the threats of deportation began, John Lennon quickly realized they were politically motivated. He publicly spoke about how many people were coming to, quote, fix his phones, and that there were, quote, strange men outside in suits who he caught following him. Lennon would eventually sue the FBI for claims of illegal wiretapping. The FBI collected a lot of nefarious information that could have presumably been used to threaten and intimidate Lennon and Yoko Ono. They knew the whereabouts of Ono's daughter, Kyoko, for example, according to the New York Times. Unfortunately, when President Richard Nixon was reelected, the deportation threats continued, and Lennon became more and more paranoid. But documents unearthed years later would prove that he had a good reason. Correspondence from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to Nixon's chief of staff confirmed that the White House was directly involved in Lennon's surveillance. There was never any proof that John Lennon was a communist or a Marxist, but that didn't stop the FBI from trying to label him as such. It probably didn't help that Lennon related his song Imagine to the Communist Manifesto. The song was released in 1971, at the peak of the FBI's investigation. Imagine became a revelation known worldwide. In Rolling Stone, David Frick writes, in 22 lines of lullaby rhyme, Lennon combined pungent social argument, imagine a world without artificial divisions of faith, politics, and greed, with a solace and promise in his voice and piano that could cut through utter gloom. Now Lennon hadn't just released Give Peace a Chance and touted the message war is over around a dozen cities during Christmas 1969, but he had released Imagine, a deeper, more meaningful manifesto of sorts. Yoko Ono said, it's not like he thought, oh, this can be an anthem. It was just what John believed, that we are all one country, one world, one people. He wanted to get that idea out. John Lennon was very outspoken about government tyranny and a capitalist system he felt exploited workers, as well as socioeconomic inequality. These beliefs played right into giving the FBI justification for their covert ops. In 1971, Lennon gave a notably candid interview to Red Mole, which is now Socialist Resistance, in which he told Tariq Ali, I've always been politically minded and against the status quo. He also mentioned that he was, quote, very conscious of class. In the interview, which also includes Yoko Ono, the couple discussed world politics, including in Europe and Russia, as well as how intellectual revolutionaries like Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin were able to, quote, get through to the workers. He also relates his political views back to his song Working Class Hero. Lennon's unapologetic public rhetoric endangered his chances for U.S. citizenship and continued to make him the target of surveillance from the FBI and the Nixon administration. John Lennon was accused of funding what the FBI coined the Alamuchi Tribe, a protest organization run by a handful of the former Chicago Seven. It turns out that Lennon donated $75,000 with the goal of helping the group form a demonstration against the 1972 Republican National Convention. People who have analyzed the FBI's actions have since noted that Lennon's anti-war, pro-workers' rights rhetoric had been going on for years, but the FBI investigation began on the cusp of the convention in January 1972, where President Richard Nixon was a favorite to become re-elected. At this time, not only were Lennon and his family put under surveillance, but deportation proceedings also started. The New York Times also notes that once Nixon was re-elected in November of the same year, the FBI closed its investigation on Lennon. Upon closer inspection, it appeared that Nixon's goal was to keep Lennon from swaying voters. During the deportation process, Lennon and his lawyers argued that the action was a direct result of his comments that were critical of Nixon. His lawyers also made appeals that caused a significant enough delay to allow Lennon to stay in New York. The FBI couldn't pin John Lennon down on anything concrete. Most of the 300-page documents they created simply involved speaking of Lennon as someone with, quote, revolutionary and proletarian leanings. Additionally, some of Lennon's song lyrics were included as examples of his politics, such as those from Power to the People. The Bureau outsourced informants, paying them to spy on Lennon by attending his concerts and speeches, according to SF Gate. This tactic had been used on cultural icons in the past, including Charlie Chaplin and Pablo Picasso. Unfortunately, the FBI's plan to catch Lennon revolved around a mere theory that Lennon and his friends and family were planning a Get Out the Vote concert tour to recruit newly of age voters.
If you register to vote, it doesn't say you have to vote. At least you have it. And then if there's somebody around that you can believe in, you've got that vote.
Interestingly, this never happened because of President Richard Nixon's deportation obsession, meaning Nixon got what he wanted. The declassified documents suggest a level of unnecessary paranoia by the U.S. government concerning Lennon. In his 1983 suit to retrieve the documents, John Wiener was represented by ACLU of Southern California attorney Dan Marmolewski. According to an ACLU press release, Marmolewski built his case on the absurdity of it all. Marmolewski said in the release, "From the beginning, the FBI treated John Lennon as if it were a crime to sing Give Peace a Chance." John Wiener's book, Give Me Some Truth, The John Lennon FBI Files, was finally published in 2000, after he was able to retrieve and dissect the portion of declassified documents the FBI had released to him. The final 10 files were only released in 2006, the same year that a documentary that specifically focused on John Lennon's war with the U.S. government, called The U.S. vs. John Lennon, was released. It discusses the FBI files at length. In his review of the documentary, New York Times critic A.O. Scott writes, "What distinguished Lennon and Yoko Ono from many of their contemporaries was their ability to capture and make use of the absurdities of their fame. They came off as canny self-satirists in earnest devotion to the cause." Perhaps this talent of theirs acted as a saving grace during their turbulent experience in early 1970s America. The FBI's bizarre and out-of-touch tactics didn't hurt either.